My parents, they don't really believe in education. I mean, my mother, she never even went to middle school. My father dropped out of high school. My grandfather, well, surprisingly, he actually made it to college, but he dropped out. And the reason all this is probably happening and why they think like that is because now my grandpa, yeah, he had a year of college, but he doesn't have much money. Meanwhile, my father, who dropped out of high school, became very successful in his trade. So imagine his excitement when I tell him, "Dad, I want to follow up and do trades just like you." Yeah, just kidding, I didn't tell him that. What I really told him is, "Dad, I'm going to college." Well, guys, he absolutely blows up on me, disowns me, kicks me out of the house. Well, I'm going to tell you something. The joke's on him. Because when I left the house, he decides that the rest of my siblings, who, by the way, are in basically middle school at this time, they're not going to finish. He's taking them out so they don't get any bright ideas of going to college. Well, here's why the joke's on him. A few years later, I do go to college, and I was struggling to get through it. Thanks to my mother, who, by the way, went against my father to do this on the low. Shh, don't tell anyone. Guess what happens next? I get successful, I get rich, and I give everything to my mother and my siblings, and I leave my father high and dry, and this is what he decides to say.
Hi there. I am the first child of my parents, and I discovered that there are times when you may need to act disobedient if you'll make progress in life. My father never went beyond high school, and this was a result of the hatred he had towards the education system. I did not initially understand why. He was a very skilled cobbler, one of the two we had in our town where we lived, and he had gone into business right after his high school education. His mentality was twisted, and his understanding was very limited. He knew nothing like family planning and just went on getting my mother pregnant. They decided to stop childbirth when they had given birth to 6 kids. Right from when we were little, my siblings and I have always had aspirations. This one wanted to be a lawyer, the other one wanted to be a doctor, while some others wanted to be something else, this, that, or the other. My father started from the onset of discouraging us from those. He told us with all seriousness that the whole of us kids would not go beyond high school, as that was both a waste of time and finances. He wasn't joking, not at all. We all listened to him over time, saying that we would rather be traders, who either joined in on the family business or did a trade of our own. My mother, who had never seen the 4 walls of a classroom in her entire life, seemed to value education more. She had enough sense to try to ask my father to let us do what we were passionate about, as not everybody could be involved in a trade skill. If everyone were buying and selling, who would be the doctors treating and the engineers building? My father is stubborn and just insisted that he was saving us a lifetime of regret. As I progressed in my academic journey, my desire to be an engineer just kept on soaring higher and higher. Well, I finally graduated from high school and simply applied for college. I soon got admission and decided to share the news with my parents. I went into my parents' room. It was that evening and started by reminding my father of the fact that I was a high school graduate, you know. I still had a lot to say, but he just cut in and basically said he's aware and had been making plans to sponsor me into learning a trade. This was the trade talk I did not want to hear, and after he was done talking about his plan for me, he then asked me what I wanted to say. I wanted to lie that I was done talking, but I knew sooner or later I would have to tell them I had gotten admission into college, so I just broke the news to him. I told my dad that I had applied for college a few weeks back, and I just got the report that had granted me admission. So, my mother wanted to be happy for me, but she knew my father could fall out with her for drumming support for me, so she just remained calm. My father's facial expression changed. I knew it was a signal that he was displeased and was about to call for my head. He asked if I was deaf or purposefully chose to ignore what he had been saying over the years, and then he barked at me for going behind his back just to apply for admission when he had told me I was about to be a traitor. My father's voice was raised at the point and I was shaking, but I had to air my opinion out. I told him that I had zero passion for trading and it had always been my desire to be an engineer. My dad said, "The passion for the business was not necessary," and I quote you this.
"Oh, you just need to get into it, and the passion will come once you start making the money."
Everything isn't always about money, Dad. But I just kept quiet and sobbed. My mom did not say anything, even though, well, I knew she would try talking to my father later on, as she did not want to do so right there to avoid him thinking she was joining me in a rebellion. Father just dismissed me by saying I would thank him in the future. The next few days saw me all by myself. My younger siblings were all sympathetic for me, and the fact that my father was standing as an obstacle to me and college meant that my younger siblings too could kiss any future aspiration outside of trading goodbye. My mother tried her best to comfort me, but it was just too painful. My father, who had been noticing the whole thing, came to me one morning and asked me to dress up as we would be visiting my granddad. Up until that time, neither of my brothers and sisters had set eyes on our granddad. All we knew was that my father occasionally sent money for his upkeep. I wondered what was going to see my granddad had to do with the recent happenings in my life. I was not interested, but I could not simply oppose it. My dad went to the countryside to visit his father, and we met him at the front porch smoking. I was so stunned the moment they began exchanging pleasantries. My father was nothing like his father. My granddad's English was so polished, and he had said some words which I literally never heard before. I knew there was no way someone like that had not seen the four walls of a school building. As though my father could read my thoughts, he said my grandfather was a college dropout who loved books, but who had nothing to show for it. My father then turned to Granddad and said I wanted to go to college to waste both time and resources, which, by the way, was limited. He equally told him of my rebellion towards his plans for me to go learn a trade at trade school. Grandpa looked at me in amazement and said I was going in a direction that would lead to future regret. It was then he made me understand why it seemed like my father, aka his son, hated academics with an absolute passion. You see, Grandpa, who was the only one among his siblings who took education seriously back then, lacked what it took to go through college. While his siblings took to trade and did become successful, he dropped out of college and had to go back to learn a trade. The whole thing set him back, and that was the reason his son, my father, had chosen to jump right into trading after school. He'd gone to extend his academics to the point of high school because he wanted to know how to read and write, a skill that he felt was needed for business. Well, his mentality, oh man, so myopic. I listened to my grandfather try dissuading me from going further in academics, as he claimed I was well equipped to help support my father in the business or start my own. I did not argue, I did not say a word. I just nodded my head like I was seeing sense in what he was actually saying, but my mind remained unchanged. We finally left his place, and I could not help but imagine that I came from a lineage of high school and college dropouts. The visit to Grandpa's was a failure for Dad. It was, however, a success for me, as it inspired me to break the curse of nobody graduating in my family line. My mother wanted to find out how the trip had gone, and my father told her it went swell. And I was no longer considering going to college, but my mother was surprised. She knew how passionate I have grown about becoming an engineer. She approached me that night to speak with me, and I told her my father had mistaken my silence to mean I had changed my mind. I told her I did not want to end up like my father and his father, and I expressed my desire to go to college, even if it means taking on several jobs just to support myself there. My mother gave me emotional support. She even promised to help me out financially too, and my mom and I decided to talk to Dad the next morning before he left for his business. I told him I was too passionate about becoming an engineer to let go. This was followed by me telling him I was still willing to attain another height in my academic pursuit. I did not expect my dad to promise funding of my college tuition, so I told him that I would be taking jobs to support myself. My mother equally noted that she was going to do her best to support me. After we had both spoken, my father stayed calm for a while. My dad looked up and began attacking my mom and me verbally. He claimed I was being disobedient and dishonorable while my mother was giving me support. He claimed we had both betrayed him and he was not going to let it slide. According to him, he had trained me in high school so I could get the necessary knowledge that would make me useful to him in business. But my mother had teamed up with me to make sure I defiled him by going to college. He then noted that he was taking his hands off the education of my other siblings, and my father's decision to no longer sponsor his children's education was so strategic. He knew that there would be no talk of college from any of us, as my direct younger siblings was not even done with junior high. He told my mother, "Go ahead, sponsor my siblings and me, since she was the sponsor of the rebellion, you know." Well, that was so wicked. He knew my mother, who was taking different jobs, simply could barely support me in college, and having her take up the responsibility of the other kids would absolutely cripple her savings, thereby making her unable to support me and ultimately forcing me to quit school. My father, well, he walked out on us. Well, he was snubbing us. Neither my mother nor I even cared. We knew he was just trying to do that to bend us to his will, and the time I was to leave for college soon arrived, and I had to leave. My mother and I have been working hand in gloves by saving up money through the various jobs that we took on. I vividly remember the day I was leaving for college. It was on a weekend, and my father was seated in the parlor. I know it was disrespectful to leave the house without talking to him, so I approached him to tell him, "Hey, I'm leaving." He snubbed me. After standing like a fool for a few minutes, my mother signaled for me to leave. I got to college, and it was not easy. The money which I had come with quickly got exhausted, and my mother had done her best. She had occasionally sent me money, but it was not enough, as she was equally taking care of my siblings' education too. I had taken on several jobs as planned, but it was not working out. I discovered it was really difficult keeping up with my academics. I had exams coming up, and I equally had some fees that needed to be cleared. The school authorities warned that students who were yet to pay up their debts would not be allowed to write. I had to leave school and travel down to tell my parents of the recent developments. My father never called me to find out how I was faring, and he did not look excited to see me when I returned. My mom was the first person whom I told about my predicament. She was really sad for me. She explained to me that it had been difficult keeping up with the schooling expenses of me and my siblings, as she was the only one shouldering the burden. All my father did was provide food when he wanted to. The rest of his money was reinvested into the business. My mother, she suggested we both talk to Dad. I knew it was going to be a futile attempt, but Mother insisted. We waited until after my dad must have had dinner before approaching him with the issue. My father did not snub me like before, but his response to each statement I made was so cold. I even began fidgeting along the way. My mother, seeing my disposition, cut me short and took off where I stopped. She explained to my father the whole situation, and my father asked what he wanted him to do. Well, hearing my father ask what we wanted him to do gave us a bit of hope that, he could give us the money. I immediately said I needed money to clear up my debt in school, and he busted out laughing. I'd never seen him laugh so hard in my entire life. He He momentarily stopped to ask what happened to my mom and me, claiming we would shoulder my college cost. He said nothing, and he resumed his laughter. After he was done with his laughter and mockery, he got serious and warned my mother to me and to never speak to him about money for school, as a dime of his money would never go into education when he wanted to use, me for business expansion. As my mother and I turned to leave, we could hear him resume his laughter and mockery, and this just left a deep wound inside my heart. My mother had to sell off some of her trinkets, which had marketable value, and even at that, it wasn't even close to enough to clear my debt. She had to rally the remaining friends, and, I got back to school and I was able to write my exams. The rest of my years in college weren't as difficult as the first. My younger siblings had to quit school because of me, as my mother could only manage paying everyone's tuition no longer. This sacrifice was something I was determined to never forget. Well, guys, I graduated from college as an engineer and came back home. The plan was to get a job and become successful enough to make my father oppose my education, but it was not easy getting a job. I'd gone to a different job interview, and there was positive replies from them. I was at home most of the time, and the only time I went out was when I wanted to go for an interview. My father called me one evening, in the presence of my mom and younger siblings, to ask what I was doing with my life. Well, I told him about the job interviews, and saying that I've been attending and how I hoped for a favorable reply. This was my father's opportunity to absolutely humiliate me, and he took full advantage of it. He told my other siblings that I was simply reaping the fruits of my rebellion. I stood with my head bowed in shame as my father pointed out to my siblings that I could have been successful in business if I had just listened to his advice 4 years ago, just to get into the trade business with him. He said I had stubbornly chased after passion, and the only thing I had to show for it was an empty engineer title to my name, and I was so darn humiliated. Besides the humiliation which I suffered, my father's words had eaten deep into my siblings, and I knew it could make them give in and learn a trade skill. I could not even sleep at night. My mother spoke to me the next morning after my dad left for work just to encourage me. She asked me to not give up so that things would soon fall in place. My mother's faith in me meant a lot. Honestly, I don't think I would be where I am today without my mother. Things got worse with my father after he humiliated me. Everything I did seemed to offend him. It was as though he was disgusted by the mere sight of me, and my father returned from his shop one evening and found me eating at the dining table. I'd gone for an interview that same day, and it was not successful. I was really hungry, so I just took my frustration out on the meal my mother had made for me. I greeted my father, who did not respond. He just stood looking at me for a few seconds before shaking his head in disapproval as he left. I knew the thoughts that were going through his head, but I simply did not care. My father walked back to me a few minutes later to tell me that I was to join him in his shop the next day, but the issue was this. I had an interview to attend. It was one of the places where I had submitted my CV and had asked me to come for an interview the next day. I told my father about the interview, and guys, he absolutely flared up. He said I had been doing 2 things since I got out of school: going for these silly interviews and wasting time at home eating free food. He said that I was old enough to be feeding myself and warned that if I did not show up at his shop the next day, he would prohibit my mom from giving me food. Wow. My dad left the next morning after reminding me to show up at his shop, and I spoke with my mom after he left, and she advised I went for the interview anyways. Before going to my father's shop, I went for the interview, and though it was not supposed to take long, it did. My mind was on my father's shop all throughout the interview, and I'm glad it did not ruin my performance. I got the job at the end of the day, and I was too overjoyed to remember the threat my father had issued that morning. So, I went straight home and informed my mother and siblings about it, and they were so darn happy for me. My father came home, and it dawned on me that I had simply disobeyed and disappointed him once again. I wasn't scared, though, as I felt he would understand once he learned that I have done it. I have gotten the job with a top construction firm. Well, my dad stormed the house and asked why I had chosen to disrespect him. I simply tried to explain to him, but the moment I mentioned that I had gone for an interview, he absolutely lost it. He didn't wait to hear the part about me getting a job, didn't even wait for a second. My father, well, he kicked me out of the house that night, and I stayed with a friend for about 2 months, till I got enough money to rent an apartment for myself. I'm currently living in my apartment, and though it's not really great, I am resolved to not give up. I don't want to make my mom regret ever having faith in me, you know. What's up, everybody? Mr. Reddito here. So I do have a few updates, and I want to let you know the story might not go the way you think it's gonna go. Pause the video, go down to the comment section, and tell me, what do you think's going to happen in these next few updates? I just want to see what you're thinking, and we can go back after the video and see how close we were. And by the way, if you're not subscribed to the channel, we are about to hit 100,000 subscribers. So go ahead, subscribe to the channel for daily videos, and let's jump into update number 1. I can't believe it's been 4 years since I last updated. Really, 4 long years. Well, the young and broke guy who has been telling this story is now a completely different person. Yes, my story, it's changed for the better. I'd experienced little success during my first year working, and I decided it was best to apply for my master's degree program. I did it for 1 year, and I got several job offers after that, and the company where I worked had to make a better upgrade to my contract just so they could retain me. Things have been going great for me ever since, and well, I'm proud to say, I am the desk engineer of a firm. I have an official car. I have a house. I got a dissatisfying report from my siblings yesterday, though. The sacrifice which my mom and siblings made for me was still fresh in my heart, and I decided I was not going to let it go unrewarded. Immediately, things got comfortable for me. I started sending money for my siblings to go back to school. They're still young and still had time on their hands. My mother, well, she informed me that my father had been asking how she was covering the cost of my younger siblings. Well, their education without sweating, and when she said I was responsible for it, he just kept quiet. That news made me decide just to visit my family, and well, I visit them for 3 days. That was the first time I was visiting ever since my father threw me out of the house. I made sure to visit on a weekend when the whole family would be around. My siblings were playing on the front porch of the house when I drove in, and they alerted our parents, who came looking shocked as they were not expecting a visitor. I would not trade the joy of the facial expression of everyone gave for me for anything. Everyone except my father rushed towards me. He just walked back inside and closed the door. I got into the house and greeted my father, but he responded very coldly. But I must have known that was coming. I mean, from a place of shame which he was trying to mask under his resentment. I can't think of any of his relatives who own a car. Neither he nor his father did, and I did not bother establishing a discussion with him. I just wanted him to see how I had turned out after he had written me off. My mom, my younger siblings, well, we all had a great time. I left the house without saying goodbye to my dad. I promised my mom that I was going to help set up a business for her in the coming months. Well, guys, I received a call yesterday from my younger, and he said that Mom had begun standing up to Father ever since I came by. She rubbed it in his face that he had thrown me out of his life because I wanted to find my own path. But I ended up doing much better than he ever did. She noted she was glad I had bent to his demands, otherwise I might be a shop owner. And that would be regarded as a failure when compared to my success today. Anyways, My father poured out his frustration on my mom by hitting her. I'm still thinking about what to do, but I must do something.
Update number 2.
I noted during my last update that my father hit my mother because she told him the truth. I called my mother to find out if what Jacob had told me was true, and though she evaded the question, I knew it to be. I ignored it though, as I was still not happy. Once a husband raises his hand on his wife for the first time and nothing's done, it would become a reoccurring affair. My mother called me 2 days later and informed me that my father needed money to expand his business and she wanted me to help. This same business expansion we've been hearing about for so long, right? One of the excuses he had refused to help out with my academics. Wow. I told my mother that if he wanted my money, he should ask me directly for it. I surprisingly received a call from my dad. I knew the fact that he swallowed his ego to call me meant he was in dire need of it. I asked him to come by the city where I'm staying at so we could talk more about it in person. I gave him an appointment and my father made the trip. From the small town where they stayed down to the city where I resided and worked was about a 2-hour trip. I'd purposely scheduled the meeting at my office, and my father got there and was surprised at the kind of prestige which I commanded. I had the secretary keep him out for a while with the excuse that I was busy. After he must have waited for an hour, I finally asked the secretary to let him in. He came into my office to find me with my legs on the table eating biscuits, and he was disgusted as he found me doing, well, nothing. But he could not react as he needed my money at the time. I acted like I did not fully understand what my father and I had discussed, so he had to recap. He began talking about how his business was no longer booming as before. How was it to move when he chose to remain archaic about it? There was no competition in the small town where he lived, and people who patronized him from the city now used online vendors that even deliver right to your doorstep. He then said he needed money to expand his business by setting up other shops outside the town where they lived. This was terrible. What he needed was not expansion. He needed to rebrand himself and get updated with the powerful tool called technology, which most people were now using. Anybody with a little bit of sense would see that my father's business was on the verge of collapse with the way that he was going about it, and that was one of the reasons I decided against putting my money. The other very important reason is that my father is not deserving of a dime from me. I laughed hard that he got confused. I noted that he had always been expanding his business ever since I could walk. I then went on to tell him I would not give him a dime before calling security to escort him out of the premises, and I'm just glad he came to the office and saw my achievements but left with absolutely nothing. Update number 3. Hey guys, so I'm currently setting my father up for a disastrous fall. After my father visited my office, he got home and began acting hostile. He blamed my mother for working with me to embarrass him, and he claimed she had asked him to reach out to me for financial assistance when she knew he would be humiliated. Jacob called me and, narrated how every now walked on eggshells around my dad in the house. I turned scared for them. What broke my heart the most was the news that my father had hit my mother for the second time. Domestic abuse is not something I watched my mother go through, so I hatched a plan. I went to the house on a weekend and pretended like I was not aware of my father's tyranny. None of my siblings came out and greeted me as they had done the previous time, and this was because they would be dealt with by father once I leave. The whole scenario gave me a clear understanding of what my young brother Jacob meant when he said that they were all walking on eggshells. My father had missed it in his relationship with us children, and he doesn't know it. He came out and was about to send me out of his home when I pleaded with him just to hear me out, as I come here because of business. I apologized for telling him that I was not going to give him a dime ever. I claimed it was just a result of stress which I was passing through lately. I told him the money he was seeking was nothing to me, and I could have easily just given it to him had it been I was not undertaking a massive project. I, however, advised him to get a loan, which I would repay before the due date.
My father asked how could he go about it, and
I readily gave him a counsel. I even encouraged him to seek a high amount of money so the business expansion could not go out without a glitch. He bought the idea and obtained a loan a few days later, and he would need to repay it in 6 months, and that's plenty of time for me to plan,
well, for it to come to actualization.
I'm positive that in less than 4 months my father would know the kind of mess that he's gotten himself into. He would be disappointed to his core when he realizes that I never intended to repay his loans. I learned from my previous discussion with Jacob that atmosphere at home is now less hostile and more serene. I'm searching for an apartment where I can relocate my mom and siblings by the time the loan sharks come for my dad.
Update number 4.
This is the final update. Hey guys, I don't think things would ever be great between my father and me. He's not just lost me, but he's lost his family and his house. You see, my father's business did not thrive in places where he set them up, and time to move by very fast. He kept on calling me, all the while to remind me of the loan repayment date. And I kept on reassuring him, oh, don't worry, I'm going to pay the debt while secretly furnishing the house I rented for mother and siblings.
He was confident in my confidence, and that was his first mistake.
My father called me a day before the due date, and I could hear the absolute sheer panic in his voice.
It was funny hearing his voice shake so much.
He told me the loan company had been sending him reminders with warnings of actions that they would take if, he defaulted. I told him something had come up and there's no way the money would be ready the next day. I asked him, hey, go ahead, try to borrow it from your friends and I would repay it in 7 days. My father began running from the pillar to pillar just so he could get anything substantial from any of his friends on short notice. Well, the loan sharks came a week later and began throwing out their things from the house. My father called me at the spot just to tell me that, what was going on, and I drove down to the place so I could see it with my own eyes. I looked worried even though I wasn't. This was exactly how I wanted things to play out. I tried seeking more time with the loan people, but they insisted that the total loan be repaid before the house is returned, so I decided to take my family where they would be, temporarily staying till I repaid the loan. I took them to the city where I had rented and furnished an apartment, and I could see relief on their faces of everybody, including my father, that they would still have a better place to lay their head. My father was about to walk into the house when I stopped him. I told him, no, you're not going to stay here, I won't allow it. I began listing the things that he had done to me, my mom, and my siblings, and none of which he ever apologized for. My mom began pleading with me, but I refused. I gave him a little bit of money just to sleep in a hotel for a few nights, as I considered the fact that it was safe journeying to the town that night. My father returned the very next day, and he's currently staying with one of his friends. His business is struggling just to get back on its feet, but the chances are so slim. But hey, it's not my business anymore.
Isn't karma such a...
So surprisingly to me, there was a lot of commenters, maybe 20% of the comments I read, that said OP went a bit too far by basically separating his father from the rest of his family, but I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, we're talking about someone that was abusive. He laid his hands on OP's mother, and he was taking away education from the entire family and forcing them to go his route. All the trade school and whatnot that he went. Not everybody thinks the same or wants to do the same thing. So no, in my opinion, I don't think OP went too far. If anything, OP did not go far enough because OP's father ended up basically getting away with all the abuse, hitting of the mother, all the physical, all the verbal. He never went to jail, nothing. All he did was basically can't live at OP's new apartment. I just want to know your thoughts on this story, guys. Do you agree with me? Do you not? If you don't, let me know your reasoning. Drop it in the comment section. Thank you guys for joining me on today's video. My name's Mr. Reddito. I narrate stories every single day. We're almost at 100,000 subscribers. So if you want more daily videos, the best way is to simply subscribe. I hope to see you guys tomorrow, and remember, it's cool to be kind. See ya!